Welcome to the virtual National Museum of American History. As many of you probably have heard, the Smithsonian is closed once again because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope that we will be able to open again soon. But in the meantime, we're able to reach all of you via Zoom around the country and around the world. Today's colloquium is part of an ongoing series. For years, we've had our Tuesday colloquium, and this sub-series is called Pandemic Perspectives. There'll be 11 different shows, and today we're looking at comfort food during a pandemic. Our panelists today are really quite inspiring. I've been very impressed to be able to work with them. Dr. Ashley Rose Young from the National Museum of American History, and Jimena Martin from LA Plaza de Cultura and Artes. Dr. Young is the historian of the American Food History Project at the museum. She curates our Cooking Up History program and is a co-curator of the exhibition Food Transforming the American Table. She is currently working on her first academic book, soon to be published, I hope, called Nourishing Networks, the Public Culture of Food in 19th Century New Orleans. Jimena Martin from LA Plaza is trained as an anthropologist. She has 25 years in education in museums across Southern California. Currently, she heads up the public program at LA Plaza, which is a very robust community involvement, including films, music series, lectures, roundtables, poetry readings, food talks, cooking class, and a virtual cooking sessions called En Casa con LA Plaza. Really quite impressive. I recommend to all of you to tune in to her work. We also have the Smithsonian affiliates to thank. The old colloquium series at the National Museum of American History was relatively small in that there was people that would just be in the building. And one of the virtues of the pandemic is that it's forced us to do these via Zoom, and we're now reaching people really across the country and the world. But the affiliates are expanding this greatly. Today we have 7 different affiliates that we're collaborating with to get these messages out. And we really appreciate their help both in reaching new audiences and providing expertise like Jimena Martin, who is part of one of the Smithsonian affiliates. Just a little bit of context on our current pandemic. COVID-19 has really changed our lives considerably. But in 1918, the influenza was also really quite horrendous. As of today, in the COVID-19 pandemic, about 258,000 people have died in the United States. Really pretty staggering. By comparison, in 1918, throughout that entire pandemic, 675,000 people died. That was in a country that only had 103 million. Today we have 331 million. So the depths of the pandemic in 1918 were really quite a good deal larger. When we decided to launch this comfort food session, we immediately realized that we weren't sure what comfort foods were. So we did a little informal poll and came up with a lot of interesting answers that we'll talk about throughout this program. It was very informal and unscientific, largely American History Museum employees, but then we involved LA Plaza and suddenly the answers started to change significantly. So I'm sure our panelists will have a lot to say about that. I'd like to kick it off with our panelists to think about the notion of what comfort food is. But before I do that, I want to remind all of our viewers, the audience, that they too can participate. They can be part of this group by using the Q&A function. You can send in questions, and we will be able to read those questions. We really encourage you to be part of the panel, to push us in ways that we may have missed, and be part of the story. So to get the ball rolling, Ashley and Jimena, I'd like you to think about, what are comfort foods? Why are they so soothing? Jimena, would you like to give it your first crack?
Jimena, take that one.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, first of all. So happy to participate. Comfort food, very interesting, because in the Latino community, there is no word for comfort food. The closest thing is comida casera, so the home foods. So when I think of comfort foods, I think of also the hands that made the food, the who made the food, and also think about the process. So that's where I'm coming from, more from how we define comfort food as comida casera.
That's so interesting that you brought up this idea that there are different understandings of comfort food, or that comfort food isn't ubiquitous, right, across the globe, or even within the United States itself. I know I was talking with Peter a few weeks ago when we first started planning for this event, and our research really demonstrated that comfort food, as the concept we largely understand it as today, this food that, generally speaking, may remind us of our childhood, may remind us of, and bring us a sense of comfort when we eat these foods. They bring good memories. That was an idea that was largely constructed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and largely for a middle class white America. So we want to kind of explore a much more diverse concept of comfort food today, to really break down this stereotypical idea of what it started as, and understand how it has morphed and changed, and how food has brought comfort to people from, for thousands of years, and recognizing that in its different manifestations is so important. And I wanted to mention briefly, you'll see on the presentation here, this really beautiful Ethiopian coffee ceremony set. This was donated to our museum by a restaurateur named Solace Elefam, who came to the United States in 1970. And he has very strong memories throughout his life returning to Ethiopia to see his family of the traditional Ethiopian coffee ceremony. Sometimes when you visited a neighbor's home, you would sit for coffee. Sometimes women come together and sit and have these 3 pourings of coffee. And he mentioned this very specific memory he had, of these women in an Ethiopian town who came together, and after they started sipping on the first brew of the coffee, the caffeine was energizing them, they're becoming more sociable, and they started to share stories about their life and daily, conflicts, and also good things about their life. And they listened to each other as they continued to sip the coffee and brew more. And at the very end of this multi-hour long gathering, one of the women took time to read the sustenance at the bottom of the cups for each of the other women, and offered advice as to how they might tackle some of those challenges that they shared earlier in the day. And so, this was a ritual that enabled women who didn't necessarily have access to therapy as we understand it today, but had access to a really strong network of women who could comfort them through this ritual of coffee. And so I kind of want to share this idea that, it may not even be the food itself that's providing comfort, but the people that are coming together to consume and share a table, and to offer advice and comfort. So we'll keep exploring these ideas, but I wanted to share that one example.
Well, great. Thank you very much. That was really wonderful insight. When we looked at our poll, we roughly broke the different types of foods into groups, and we noticed that there were a lot of soups. So we're going to look at soups first. When you think about, when a lot of people think about comfort food and soups, chicken soup, either commercially made or homemade, seems to be very commonly occurring. But I wonder if the two of you could talk about marketing at all. How our notions of home and comfort are actually manufactured by advertisers, and we're instructed in that manner.
I'll take a stab. I mean, for me, for in regards to marketing, I think I don't know, everything was made from home. So I think about homemade soup, fideos, that was cooking in the morning and you'd smell and do. I feel that once the women at home started working, then we have the advent of these instant foods versus the home foods that we grew up with. So with that said, when I was in the market for sale to promote that. But eventually, besides Campbell's Soup, other folks started realizing the Latino market and then started gearing that kind of marketing towards a Latino community with different flavors, different colors, different ways to attract their consumers.
That's brilliant. I'm thinking about my own experiences growing up and the kind of marketing that I saw on television and your everyday commercial, especially around the holiday times. I remember a Campbell's Soup ad where a young boy was outside playing in the snow. He comes back into the house and he's basically turned into a snowman because it's so cold outside, but he's slowly starting to eat the steaming bowl of Campbell's Soup that his mother set out for him in this really loving way. And it kind of shifts to a different frame and you see the snow slowly melting off and the mom smiling and the kids smiling. And you're getting this kind of marketing message that this canned soup can represent a mother's love, and that if you're consuming it, you're partaking in that really special bond. But like Jimena, for me, comfort food soups are at the top of my list because my mother was such a great cook, and her soups, I just have such strong memories of her version of my German grandmother's beef and vegetable soup, and even my mom's white bean and ham soup. It's something about the kind of salty, fatty, warm broth that just makes me feel connected to them. I've lost both of them, and having those soups, and the homemade ones are always going to hold more of a place in my heart than Campbell's Soup. But that's just my experience. For others, it may be the instant Campbell's Soup or the canned Campbell's Soup that really hits home. But
So
for me, it's tied to my mother and my grandmother.
Campbell's certainly has a construction of whiteness early on. The Campbell Soup kids, you can clearly see, are white. In the coloring book, they're very white. But there seems to be a lot of cultural appropriation going on now. How do you feel about maybe the excitement of more diversity in soups, but sometimes, like with this Hello Fresh, I'm not sure. How do you feel about that as a hitting the mainstream America?
The tortilla soup, a homemade tortilla soup is so delicious and beautiful. But that one pot wonder is just, there's too much going on to kind of takes away from the true authenticity of the tortilla soup. And there's ongoing other videos of now more folks trying to claim how to make a pozole, how to make a birria. And the idea of the soup is there, but then they add all these other things that they think makes it authentic, which is totally not true. And I think this is one example of the one pot wonder. And also like the cauldron there, besides making beautiful soup, big batches, again, for our community, in a sense, like birria. There's been, I feel like, been a renaissance of birria in the community, in the sense of either goat or beef, and again, kind of bringing back that authenticity. I think we've gone so far off with commercial, and also now with the pandemic, of just kind of really bringing it home and recreating those flavors at home, because since we can't go to grandma's house, we can't go to mom's, again, by recreating those recipes and keeping those traditions alive.
If I can just jump in, we have a question from our audience about going back to the Campbell Soup kids. Wondering if the Campbell Soup kids are equal to or different than the Katzenjammer kids. The as a historian, Ashley, how would you deconstruct these kids from 1910? What is the Campbell Soup Company trying to say about home life?
That's a great question, Peter. I didn't hear the second half in terms of what they're compared to.
The Katzenjammer kids from the comic Sunday comics.
Well, well, that's a really good question. You know, when I think about 1910 Campbell Soup, we're thinking about a time of transition and conflict in the United States in terms of the domestic sphere. You know, women in many ways have always been working in and outside of the home. But in the 1910s, you're starting to see women more and more have jobs outside of the home, have expendable income. You'll see in the 1920s and 30s, they're going to be out in public at shopping malls, you know, not the ones we think of today, but these earlier iterations of shopping malls, expressing independence, getting out there in the world. And these changes for some more conservative individuals could cause stress, right? They could cause a sense of unwieldiness for culture. And so when you look at these little baby dolls dressed in their perfect little orderly costumes with this theme tied into the color scheme of Campbell's, you get this sense perhaps of calmness and orderliness, but also that soups, like children, like these baby dolls, are all tied to the domestic sphere and this commitment to, you know, to the home and to raising children and to raising well-fed children. I mean, nutrition was a concern at this time. Not everyone had access to a fully nutritious meal. I think back to the archives where there was a huge push to get milk out to kids, vitamin D, you know, this concern that, you know, children didn't have enough vitamins to grow strong. And so I think that's all tied into this symbolism of these Campbell's Soup dolls, and just how kind of like perfectly constructed they are. There's almost this hidden message that if you're consuming Campbell's Soup, you know, your child will be content in playing with these dolls that are also perfect and content. Now, that's just my quick interpretation, and others may have a different a reading of this, but that's what I'm kind of seeing there, is that cult of domesticity, those fears of change associated with the domestic sphere versus the public sphere.
So that's fascinating. Let's get back to the soups themselves.
Oh, yeah. I actually had a thought on that with the soups, if you don't mind me sharing.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so when Jimena was talking about Tortilla Soup, and I'm looking at this Hello Fresh card, I worked with one of our curators to bring this into the collection, actually. You know, it brings up this question for me of who has access to sharing information with their community and with a broader audience about traditional food cultures. And what you often see in the publishing industry, especially around cookbooks, is that white women for a long time have had access, but many women of color, many people of color have not had access, and to this day do not have access to publishers to get out information about their cultures and really share their personal experiences. So I want to draw our attention to this New Orleans cookbook on the page, which was published by Houghton Mifflin and written by Chef Lena Richard, who was a Black New Orleanian, who was a tremendous chef, very well respected in New Orleans in the Jim Crow South. She published this book, first self-published it in 1939, but then Houghton Mifflin, with the support of many other writers in the culinary sphere, said, we need to get this out to broader audiences, because it was the first Creole cookbook, the first cookbook of New Orleans, authored by a Black woman. Prior to that point, for decades, the cookbooks of New Orleans had been written by white men, white women, many of them not even from New Orleans. So finally, you have this woman who really broke through so many barriers, caught national attention, shared her home culture with others through this self-published cookbook, and then the broadly circulated one a year later. It really demonstrates the barriers that she had to work against to even get her perspective out into the world. And it's Black women who really shaped New Orleans culinary culture from the colonial period and through the present day. But like I said, it was decades, it was over 60 years before she was able to share her voice and to represent her community because of the barriers in place with the publishing industry. And these are barriers that writers like Toni Tipton Martin, who are publishing today, say, you know, they still exist. So it's something we need to be very well aware of.
That's fascinating. The gender barriers are certainly there. Jimena, is that something that you think is parallel in the Latino community or different?
Well, California history here with the Californios, you know, we had the indigenous folks here, and then we had the Spanish, and then eventually as California became of Mexico. And then after Mexico, it kind of opened up its borders where everyone could come. So we have this kind of international food happening in California. And right now, I don't have my book with the woman's name was Encarnacion, Recetas Encarnacion, where she is a California woman who has she was like the first Latina to create this cookbook of a collection of California recipes. She has over 1,000 recipes, and we can find them here at the LA Central Library. Again, since she was kind of in the middle of all worlds of still having Mexican roots, but then the European. So example, like for meatballs, she has like 10 different ways of making, but I feel within the Latino community, there's always been a collection of recipes to keep those traditions alive. It's just so happens that the Anglo publishers or people haven't been really interested in those stories, but within our community, we do document those recipes via either this woman who published her own book or internally with family through oral history, or having the opportunity to have them writing down. Our new generation right now are seeing that need to kind of reclaim their ancestry as being second or third generation Latinos, and seeing that our elders are leaving and how to keep those memories alive, those food memories alive. And so actually now with the telephone and Apple to actually videotape grandma making those recipes, sitting down with them so collectively, so either on paper or via their computer, there is a renaissance of keeping that. Have they been printed and presented? Absolutely. It's just that the American market has not received them well.
Well, I guarantee you nobody would want my mother's recipes, but we'll move on to the next category of baking. Certainly an area that has received a lot of answers in our polls, a lot of associations with baking. And Jimena, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about tortillas and sort of the cult of tortilla making as compared to how people think about white bread.
Well, the cult of tortilla has been pre-colonial times with the use of the metate and also the ingenious use of how to use nixtamal to break down the corn, that science that they were able to figure out to create one of the main dishes in their diet. So we can still find the metate today in use, but now with the tortilla press, it just makes things fast forward, the Industrial Revolution, mass quantities. And so with that being said, with the tortilla press, now we can create dozens and dozens and dozens. However, that's just earlier on, I do believe that there was a more pure version of the tortilla through the press, but now with all those additive ingredients, the tortillas that we have now are so much different than the ones that might have been originally pressed out in 1920. Mm-hmm. The ones in 1920, maybe, again, it was within the community, like saying where we go to our local store, local market, you would go purchase them on a daily basis or every other day or as needed. But now as folks are busy and working, we go to the market once a week. And so now what happens, those tortillas need to have additives and ingredients to extend the life shelf of that. So even as nutritious as they were back in the day with the metate and maybe 1920, the nutritional value that they are now is much different. However, again, back to that renaissance with a new generation of folks trying to figure out with food culture, which now food is really, people are really embracing and learning. Here in Los Angeles, we have this group called Kernel of Truth. These young 30 guys are going and getting GMO organic corn and actually using stone grinders to make corn from scratch, the nixtamal. So they have these huge vats, they cook it up, and then they grind them there in their space in Boyle Heights, which is predominantly Mexican-American community. And now it's kind of elevated and now put into gourmet restaurants. People can walk up. And again, it's been an awareness of going back to their roots, to real food.
So Ashley, I understand you were talking earlier off camera about ingredients shortages, and while making bread certainly became popular during this current pandemic, the 1918 pandemic has lessons in terms of ingredient problems. Could you share that?
Sure, yeah. So as Peter mentioned, in April, May, June, a lot of people had trouble finding flour, refined flour on the shelves, even, inactive yeast that you could activate with hot water and whatnot. So that made baking difficult unless you turn to traditional sourdough bread, but we could talk about that in a little bit. But I did want to share some of the research I was doing. So as Peter mentioned, I'm working on a book right now about the history of New Orleans food culture. And I was, combing through the archives, looking at newspaper articles from around 1918. And I started seeing this interesting news story that was covered over several weeks all around milk. And so what I found was that invalid cookery, so this cookery, these dishes that you would give to people who might have been ill, who might have had the flu, often was very bland. A lot of, creamy things, a lot of white flour things, in milk, and just kind of simple grains were seen as these kind of core elements of what you would feed people trying to recover from the 1918 flu. And what happened on the outskirts of New Orleans, one of the major dairy farms, their staff members contracted the flu. And so they weren't able to milk the cows or bring those products into the city, and the city experienced a major milk shortage. And the newspapers really said, we're sorry for the inconvenience, but we have to prioritize the health of those who are suffering from the flu itself. And so all milk is going to the hospitals right now to help, to help those members who are really struggling. So I thought that was kind of an interesting parallel. It's not exactly the same, but I was looking for those disruptions in our food system, past and present. And that was one of the kind of examples that I saw.
Well, that's a fantastic observation. Later in our series, we have a session on important critical workers, and maybe dairymen are part of that group. It will be interesting to see what people say. Both of you have been really stressing the importance of fine cooking, of home cooking, of innovative cooking. How do you feel about things like poppin' fresh Pillsbury Doughboy? Not everybody can cook and wants to cook. Is this cheating, or what do food historians say about things like this?
It's a quick fix. It's comforting. Yeah. It's easy. Now with, mom and dad's working at home, we're Zooming all day, working from home, and we have our little ones at, going to schools. And so it's quick and easy. It's a quick and easy way of doing versus taking the time out on a weekend per se and making the sourdough or making the bread. But it's a quick fix.
I would agree with Jimena on that. In preparation for this program, I reached out to family and friends just to ask them about what foods have become a comfort food during the pandemic in particular. And when I talked to my oldest brother, I was actually kind of surprised at first from his response, but then it absolutely made sense. So I thought he would say something similar to my response, that my mom's soups and stews were a major comfort food for him. But the reality of his life is that he's single parenting his children. He's working a full-time job, and a comfort food for him specific to this pandemic has been roast chicken that he can pick up at the local supermarket, bring home, maybe prepare some broccoli in the microwave. You're getting your nutrition, you're getting some veggies, but it's not necessarily those foods that you tie back to your childhood, but foods that are giving you a sense of comfort, that you're feeding your family, that you're providing them with a nutritious meal, and it's easy and it's fast. So I think it really depends on the situation. And I learned a lot from chatting with my brother about that.
So is food heavily gendered in terms of preparation? I guess that seems like an obvious question, but one we should ask. There's this comfort of eating versus the comfort of making. Is it equally distributed?
Well, in the outside world, like the chef world, it's predominantly men. And then now women are coming up and showing they're as worthy as the chefs out in the restaurant world, the Michelin world and all that. However, back at home, women do most of the cooking. I always think of my mom. My only thing my dad made was an amazing scrambled eggs. He made great scrambled eggs. My dad scrambled eggs. But I think for the most part, women are the heart of the home. Women do make the foods. And that's at least how it was in my home in most part, in the sense that our roles as the caregivers for the family.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead, Peter.
One of our viewers, audience members, asked a fascinating question just now. What with COVID, the sense of taste and smell is sometimes disrupted. Are the food blogs in your world really talking about the problems of creating food when you can't taste or smell the ingredients?
I follow a blog and they said, I have COVID, what to do. And so they were talking about adding textures to your meals, add spices to your meals, hot, cold. But coming from Latino perspective, spice is always welcome.
Yeah, I was talking to a family member recently who lost their sense of taste and smell because they had COVID. And interestingly, as their taste and smell was starting to come back, they noticed the first thing they were able to taste was citrus. So, adding citrus on, having lemon chicken for dinner, adding some sort of fresh lime to water would just give some sense of taste back. But what I did find interesting is he said, one of his favorite kind of go-to snacks during a normal time, if he were feeling well, would be like a smoothie, a fruit smoothie, add different things in. But when he lost his sense of taste and smell, the texture of the smoothie for him was just disgusting, in his opinion. And so he couldn't drink it. And so I think it really forced him to think about the role that texture plays in good and bad ways. He found crunchy foods really satisfying, those crisp greens, tortilla chips, you name it. But it was kind of those mushier foods that did not provide him the satisfaction, even just kind of like neutral dining experience that he was seeking as he recovered from COVID.
That's fascinating. We have to move on to our next category, but before we do so, I want to just quickly touch on toast. Toast was very high in our category. Our museum has the first industrial sliced bread slicer. So if you've ever wondered about world before sliced bread, it would be 1927, because 28 is when commercial sliced bread came in, and you can see the toaster itself. So we could do a whole session on toast. But I want to move on to snacks, both sweet and salty. And one of the things that really was very high on everybody's list were these types of snacks, and chocolate was probably the most popular. So Jimena, could you tell us a little bit about the history of chocolate? And earlier, one of our audience members asked if you could explain how the metate is actually used and what it is.
Okay, a metate, it's a stone vessel, and it usually has like a pestle, and then with that, it's used to grind corn, used to grind chilies, and also used to ground cacao. And chocolate is food of the gods, and it's indigenous to the Americas. And it was used in ceremony. One of the other items used to make chocolate is a molinillo. It's like that you spin to make this beautiful, delicious froth. And then if they didn't use the molinillo, they also poured it from one pot to the other, almost like a Turkish tea, that thing, to create this beautiful froth. Obviously, with when the arrival of Columbus, that beautiful chocolate was taken abroad, and in Europe they have their own way of making chocolate through chocolate bars. However, in the Americas, we do have the custom of still the hot chocolate. The original hot chocolate was vegan. They might have used a little bit of masa, a little bit of ground corn masa, a little bit of chili, and water. That was the base. And then through time, we have incorporated milk, sugars, and a little bit of that chili. And it's usually, we usually eat it with, drink it with a concha, especially during the holidays with champurrado, especially for the, I call them the high holidays like Day of the Dead, Christmas. And it's just a nice way of, now with the winter, but again, it's kind of acknowledging and owning the power of chocolate and where it's come from. It's something we're very proud to be part of our cultural conversations within our community.
Ashley, since you're from Pittsburgh, our next slide is really appropriate. A big category for people were salty snacks, not the sweet snacks of chocolate, but salty. And I was really surprised that people listed pickles as a comfort food. But you know, what are your thoughts about Heinz and pickles?
So that made me smile when I saw that pickles were high on the list. I was saying kind of before we started the official program that when I was growing up, you know, in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, we would have individuals from Heinz come out to the elementary schools and teach us about the business, and we'd all walk away with plastic pickle pins, which were like the most exciting thing imaginable for a second grader, to pin that little green pickle on their, you know, the breast of their shirt. I grew up eating pickles all the time. Dill pickles, you know, not necessarily the ones that we would make from scratch, like no, the actual like Heinz pickles that you would buy at the grocery store in the jar. And perhaps it's something about the crunch. There is something very satisfying that you get from a really good pickle that kind of reminds me of the crunch of like a Pringles potato chip, which is also up on the screen here. And the interesting thing about the Pringles can, you know, it was designed so that the chips wouldn't break, that you would have that perfect Pringle as you worked your way through the can. And for me, that's all about mouthfeel and that crunch that you get from certain foods.
What would a pandemic be without a pickle? But certainly, we had an audience query from a little back that I didn't get to, that I'd like to ask. I'm actually going to read the question because it's a little bit long, but it's very much, you were both addressing this about cookbooks. And the question is, can you explain a bit more why cookbooks from Native chefs, African-American women in New Orleans, or Latina grandmother in LA haven't been well received by the broader American society? It seems so counterintuitive. But is it unusual or special, specialty ingredients or requiring skills or tools that are unfamiliar to most cooks?
That's a good question. I think people just are afraid of the unknown, not knowing how that's made. But I do know, regards to kind of branching out into other cultures, into other foodways, is by condiments, by test driving some condiments, and that's like this segue to get into a food system that's not familiar to yours. And I think people love Food Network, they love watching it, but it's another thing to actually get a book and doing it hands-on. I think it's just lack of time, busy. But I feel with COVID, I know personally, it's been the opportunity to take on those challenges, pick up that cookbook, let's shake it up in the house, you know, let's do something fun and new. It's just, I think it's from within to take on that challenge and just going forward and just doing it.
Yeah, and I would say that there are examples of cookbooks authored by women of color or people of color that have done well, you know, and there's different instances. Like Lena Richards' cookbook back in 1940 did relatively well on a national scale. You know, Toni Tipton Martin's Jubilee cookbook that just came out has received much applause and has been really adored by the Black community in the United States, but also a much more diverse community. And so I think there's a place for people who are interested in really learning from individuals from a particular community about the culture of that community. But I think it's the barriers in place to even get to the point of publishing a cookbook that are really challenging for people. Oftentimes today, when you're writing a book proposal for a cookbook, you have to provide evidence that you have a large following already on social media, and you have to kind of mention all the ways that you're already a known entity so that there's an understanding that this book will have a market. And not everyone has access to that because of the barriers that aren't just in the cookbook industry, but in the restaurant industry and politics and every aspect of our society. There are so many barriers in place for people of color and for women in professional kitchens. So I think it's a kind of a systemic issue that really starts day one and kind of follows, unfortunately, and really prevents a lot of incredibly talented home cooks and chefs from sharing their stories with a broader audience.
Also, too, I think it's ingredients. I mean, I live in Southern California. We get, fruits and vegetables, and we're right next to Mexico. So we have easy access. So if someone in the middle, like in Minnesota, wants to do an escabeche, like compared to the pickles, pickled vegetables, maybe they don't have access to those types of ingredients. And so they have to go online to bring those in. So I think maybe that might be a little bit scary, not be able to access some of the ingredients to produce these recipes as well.
Yeah, I agree with you.
The audience wonders whether there's an age difference. They say, is there a difference between boomers, millennials, in terms of their willingness to accept different cookbooks?
I work with a group of millennials, and I've never seen such young foodies. They really love their food, and they'll go the extra mile, order that snack box. I feel they're more open to going to new restaurants, trying to do different things. I maybe it might be a generational thing, or also how busy they are, or what is their interest as well.
Well, I'm going to skip over popcorn in the sake of time, and we're going to move on to cooked foods. One of my favorite answers on the poll was somebody who wrote in anything my wife makes. I think he was probably talking about general cooked foods. So given that, one of the first questions we got, of course, was macaroni and cheese, which did very well on the poll. When did macaroni and cheese first come about? What is the history of macaroni and cheese?
No, that's a good question, Peter. I always think of macaroni and cheese coming about with the large-scale migration of Italians coming to the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century. In New Orleans, for example, you see a large number of Sicilian migrants coming into New Orleans, to the point where the French Quarter was commonly referred to as Little Palermo. I mean, this is kind of a forgotten aspect of New Orleans history, this really prevalent and robust presence of the Sicilian community. But I do know from my research that, by the 1910s, you start having individuals having macaroni factories in restaurants across the United States, from Delmonico's to just mom and pop places. In New Orleans, for example, macaroni would show up on the menu. It was kind of seen as this, macaroni and cheese was just a fairly popular restaurant food, but I also think it became popular at home too, with, as you see, this kind of Corningware dish, and with modern technologies from Kraft, where you're able to create these kind of shelf-stable versions of cheese where you add some hot water and voila, you have like a velvety, salty, fatty sauce. That became a comfort food for many people, I think, because of the convenience in a lot of ways, especially with Kraft mac and cheese. As a kid, I was able to throw that together when my parents were working long hours, and it became a comfort food. But for me, nothing beats a homemade mac and cheese with different, 5 or 6 different cheeses. Oh, I have some funny stories from college where my roommates and I made a mac and cheese with blue cheese in it, and yeah, it turned blue, and that was not the most appealing thing, but it was still delicious.
For me, I mean, honestly, I'm first generation, so I didn't get mac and cheese till I was in college. but I feel the ultimate comfort food is an old-fashioned quesadilla. It's gooey, it's warm. If you leave it in a toast a bit longer, it's a little crunchier. It's the go-to. It's the go-to for comfort, besides a corn quesadilla or a flour quesadilla. And then just filling it up with, I was talking to my boss earlier. He says he loved a quesadilla with a piece of salami, a piece of bologna, excuse me, or the hot dog, grilling the hot dog over the grill and putting it in there. And just an old-fashioned, delicious quesadilla.
It really makes sense that every culture has its own version of similar foods. Mashed potatoes, of course, are important, as well as things that are cooked in a pot. Ashley, I understand that this 1980s cooking pot has an interesting backstory to it.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring this pot up. When you look at the image, it's kind of battered. You can see that it's been very well used. It doesn't sit flat on a surface. The bottom of the pot is kind of rounded. And this was actually a cooking pot brought by the Karim family, who were refugees during the Iraqi Kurdish civil war in the 90s. And they fled with very few items to Vietnam, eventually to the United States and Texas around 1997, and eventually to Virginia, where they settled. And they brought this pot with them through that really horrendous, challenging, unsettling time. And they used it to cook familiar foods, soups, stews. And, I wanted to share this object because comfort foods, aren't always just an instant packet of mac and cheese that you consume while watching Netflix, right? They can be survival foods. They can be foods that you bring with you during tremendously difficult times. I think of the history of slavery in the United States and this huge body of scholarship looking at African culinary traditions, African knowledge, and agricultural practices, and how these ideas and these memories served as an anchor for a community that was fighting against a horrendous slave society. And food persisted despite that. Okra was a constant for these communities. And to this day, stewed okra as part of a celebration. It's a celebration food. It's something that you consume with family and friends. And that's been across centuries. And so I think it's an interesting idea to think of those more difficult times and the resilience of communities and how food can really be that material, that tangible connection to a past, especially when you have a really oppressive society trying to rip that from you and strip that from you.
That's beautiful. Two of our audience members pointed out that Thomas Jefferson served macaroni pie at the White House made with Parmesan. So it really does show that continuation. But we have a question here for Jimena, really building upon her quesadilla versus mac and cheese. And the visitor says lasagna, clearly Southern Italian American, but is there a Tex-Mex equivalent? Are cheese enchiladas sort of a doppelganger to lasagna?
Absolutely, absolutely. Layers of corn and cheese and great red sauce. Absolutely.
Well, let's move on to our very last category of carryout. We've really been looking at isolation in the house and what you might be able to make yourself. But carryout is, and here we can see in the picture, carryout with curbside delivery is certainly something that's important. Pizza was very high on the list, and my personal experience is pizza prepared at home. Sometimes people make good pizza, but most pizza that people talk about requires a fair amount of specialized equipment and really technical knowledge. What is your perception of pizza in the American diet?
I was going to say it's getting stronger. It's having a stronger and stronger presence. When we were refreshing the food exhibition at the National Museum of American History, we worked with a marketing research firm to kind of understand some of the trends and changes over time of what Americans were consuming. And pizza is becoming even more popular than it's ever been. And I have some personal, like very strong connections to pizza. Sometimes pizza makes my, if I were going to die tomorrow, what would be my last meal? And I had the privilege of going to school in New Haven, Connecticut, where there is a strong pizza culture and a love for thin crust pizzas. And I tell you, I have really strong and beautiful memories of getting pizza, sitting down at the restaurant or getting it to go and enjoying that with my friends. I will say pizzas that I loved in my youth from kind of the chain stores, they're not my favorite anymore. They're a little bit too sweet, a little too doughy. And I think that's interesting that our comfort foods can change over time, even within like a particular dish, how it's prepared can change.
And also the ingredients. Now we put Mexican chorizo, we put jalapenos, we put other items on there. With Los Angeles, right now we're shutting down, but still the pop-ups. So maybe not so much the restaurants and takeout, but the pop-ups through Instagram to know like the taco vendor at different places or different types of food, tortas, different type of sandwiches. So to go out, and that maybe not, it's not the same to have a taco like brought to the home, but a lot of people to go out and also to support. I think another part of the pandemic is to support our independent pop-up vendors as well, to go out there and keep a look. I know initially I know they were making tamales. There was one vendor selling tamales and it was all through Instagram, everything through PayPal. And you just text them, I'm here and here are your tamales to go. Again, it's just for me personally, it was just a matter of going out to the community for the pop-up, not so much stuff coming in. Again, another way of supporting the community.
Yeah, I think that street food culture is so key. Peter, if I could just add one more thing, I was going to say, during a time like the pandemic, which has financial and economic repercussions on so many people who might be forced to close down their restaurants if they had a brick and mortar spot, or individuals who may have lost a job in a different industry, street food vending is kind of part of an informal economy that can enable people to sell foods to accrue enough profits to stay afloat during this really difficult time. So Jimena, going out and supporting your local street food vendor or your pop-up vendor can be so key in keeping alive these culinary traditions and these businesses during these difficult times.
Yeah.
Before we close, I did want to share this culturally challenged sign. This was collected from Manhattan, from a place on Broadway. Chinese American and Spanish food. Seems like an odd combination. But I wonder whether a lot of, certainly a lot of carryout food and even comfort food isn't actually very good. Is that okay? Can we hold our heads up when we eat bad food, or should it always be really excellent?
It's whatever fills the soul.
Exactly.
Whatever fills the soul. You want that chicken, that fried stuff. If it makes you feel good during these times, please go. Please do go for it. Eat your.
Yeah. I think I'm with Jimena on that one. When we're facing a global pandemic and people are unsure as to whether or not when their next meal might be, whatever is going to bring you comfort at this time, I fully support it.
So to end, I want to ask a question from our audience that I think that is really close to your hearts. And the audience member says, some of my favorite memories aren't of food itself, but of watching my mother make them and the old tools they use. I wish I still had her food grinder, even though my food processor does it better. What do you think that the human aspect of food, that connection is really a critical element?
Process. And one thing we didn't talk about was the smells. Smells is another way of activating those food memories. and who makes it. It's just all one, all in one thing, you know, the process of being made, who made it, and then to sit back and enjoy it.
I totally agree. And I love, I have objects from my mother, my grandmother's that I use, you know, kitchen tools, my mom's wooden spoon, you know, that's worn on the edge, that stirred so many soup pots. Every time, like honestly, every time I use it, I think of her. My grandmother's rolling pin, her 1970s era hand mixer, which releases so much ozone when I plug it in, that like that smell from an electric appliance. It doesn't work well at all, but there's something about baking and using my grandmother's tools that connects me to her. And my other grandmother's cast iron skillets. You know, my dad and I both have so many memories of her preparing breakfasts in those skillets. And it just brings a smile to my face right now, talking about, you know, reconnecting with those memories through these objects that I still have at home. It's that tangible connection for people I've lost, you know, that aren't in my life physically anymore, but are certainly there in my heart. And that's, you know, important.
And for folks who migrated, I'm sorry, just real quick, folks who migrated and didn't have the opportunity to bring in their favorite kettle and things like that. But when people travel, they bring their recipes and those traditions travel with them. So maybe with the new generation, first generation, they can create those items that our children remember about that wooden spoon, that wooden pot. But at the end of the day, at least they have the recipe and the food memory. So hopefully for the next generation, we'll be able to have those tangible things, but those recipes that we have in hand, especially with oral history as well.
Well, that is a wonderful place to end on memories of food. And Jimena Martin, Ashley Rose Young, I really want to thank you for a wonderful hour of, I wish we could spend more time and dive into this even more. For anybody that came in a little bit late and wants to check things out, you can go to our webpage, americanhistory.si.edu, Pandemic Perspectives, and you can see a recording of it. If you have notions about what the museum should be collecting related to COVID-19, be it food or any other aspect of the pandemic, you can send us a note at covid19@si.edu. And I hope everybody will tune in on December 1st for what museums are doing around collecting COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. So thank you very much. Wonderful job. Appreciate you participating.